She was home alone until she saw strange men approaching. It was a seemingly ordinary morning in a modest house by the coast, surrounded by tall trees, overgrown grass, and the kind of heavy silence only found in places far away from everything. The kind of place where time feels frozen, where neighbors live miles apart, and where any unusual movement stands out. But that morning, no one was watching. Inside, Ellie, a 12-year-old girl, was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by books, pens, and a few old dolls she still insisted on keeping, even though she hadn't played with them in years. She was scribbling in her notebook, writing a story about a spy who saved the world, clearly inspired by the stories her grandfather used to tell, filled with details that never felt entirely made up. Ellie's mom had left early that morning for the hospital, called in last minute to cover a shift. The two of them lived alone, and her grandfather, Jack, was far away, miles off at a military base where he still served in the Navy Reserve, or at least that's what everyone believed. What no one knew was that someone had been watching. A black car, with dark tinted windows and a shiny paint job, slowly climbed up the narrow dirt road and stopped in front of the house. Inside, two men sat in silence for a few seconds, scanning the property with cold, calculating eyes. No fence, no cameras, no one around, one of them muttered, narrowing his eyes. "This is the place. The mom left before sunrise. The girl's alone," the other replied, already reaching for the door handle, while Ellie casually underlined a sentence in her notebook with a blue pen, completely unaware of what was coming. The men stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch. They thought it would be easy, but they were about to find out. That girl wasn't as alone as she seemed. The first creak of the door sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the house. Ellie looked up from her notebook instantly, the pencil slipping from her fingers and rolling under the table. For a second, she wanted to believe it was just the wind, or maybe some weird noise from the old house's structure. But then came the footsteps. Heavy, confident, the kind of footsteps made by someone who doesn't ask permission to come in. Her heart pounded in her chest. She stood up so fast, she nearly tripped over her own feet. She peeked through the crack in the living room door and saw, farther down the hall, two figures crossing the entryway like they owned the place. Without thinking, Ellie ran down the hallway and ducked into the first bedroom she found. She knew exactly what she had to do. Her grandpa always used to say, "If you're ever scared, don't try to handle it alone. Hide, take a deep breath, and call me. Communication is your greatest weapon." She squeezed herself into the narrow closet, between old clothes and dusty boxes, and pulled the walkie-talkie from the pocket of her hoodie. A special gift that, to anyone else, looked like a simple toy, but to Ellie, it was a silent promise that she would never be truly alone. In the dark of the closet, holding the device with both hands, she pressed the side button and, with a voice shaking from fear, whispered, "Grandpa, someone's here. I'm hiding." Outside, the sounds grew louder, drawers being yanked open and emptied with force, doors slamming into walls. Heavy footsteps crossing the bedroom. One of the men muttered something Ellie could barely make out. "Search fast. We grab the girl and get out." The closet creaked under the pressure of a heavy hand trying to open the door. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, trying to disappear inside that small space. And then, the walkie-talkie gave a quiet crackle, breaking the muffled silence. Before the panic could take over, the voice she knew better than any other cut through the air. "I hear you, Ellie. Stay calm. I'm on my way. No matter what happens, I'll find you." The man's hand on the doorknob hesitated, like he sensed something was off. And far away, much farther than Ellie could imagine, someone had already started to move. Someone who had sworn he would never fail her. Help was already on its way. And if this story has already pulled you in, go ahead and hit the like button. It really helps a lot. And if you believe that love and courage still make a difference in this world, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because what's coming next will show you that sometimes all it takes is a promise to change everything. So take a deep breath, because this story is just getting started. Miles away, in a quiet room inside the Naval Reserve Base, Jack Miller was finishing up some routine reports. The clock on the wall showed it was just past 9 in the morning, and most of the officers were still moving slowly, like it was shaping up to be just another ordinary day. But for Jack, the day changed in the blink of an eye. The subtle vibration of his phone on the desk was the first thing that caught his attention. He frowned. That direct line was reserved strictly for emergency alerts. Without any visible rush, but with his muscles tensing like a predator ready to strike, he grabbed the device. On the screen, a red notification was flashing. "Intrusion alert, Miller residence." For a second, the world seemed to stop. The background noise, the voices, Even his own breathing, everything faded into a distant echo. Jack tapped the notification and opened the remote security panel. Images from discreetly hidden cameras showed strange movements around the house. Two men, walking with purpose, sweeping through the rooms. And then came the sound that made his blood run cold. The faint crackle of the walkie-talkie coming through the audio system, and his granddaughter's voice. "Grandpa, someone's here. I'm hiding." Jack's expression changed instantly. The warmth he usually carried when talking about Ellie vanished like smoke. His eyes hardened. His shoulders stiffened, and all that carefully measured calm gave way to something more primal. He was no longer just the loving grandfather people saw every day. He was the elite operator, the man trained to act without hesitation, to protect his own at any cost. He stood up from the chair with a quiet firmness that made two nearby officers stop what they were doing, just to look at him. Jack didn't have to say a word. Those who knew him understood right away. Something serious was going on. He was already grabbing his emergency kit when, through the private radio channel, he answered with the most steady and reassuring voice Ellie could have hoped to hear. "I hear you. Stay where you are. I'm on my way, and no one's gonna touch you while I'm still breathing." Without wasting another second, Jack walked out the doors of the base, already planning every step. His personal war had just begun. Jack Miller didn't run. He walked, fast, precise, each step measured with the discipline of someone who's faced situations where a single second could mean the difference between life and death. As he moved through the main hallway of the base, he was already typing out quick messages on his phone, using codes that only a handful of men in the country would still recognize. Across the city, across the state, and even in nearby towns, communication devices buzzed quietly. These weren't open calls, and they weren't ordinary cries for help. They were silent signals, sent only to those who, once upon a time, had sworn never to leave each other behind, no matter how much time had passed. It didn't take long. In less than 30 minutes, they began to show up. In the unremarkable parking lot of an old hardware store, men with steady steps, ordinary clothes, and eyes that spoke of decades of combat started to appear, one by one. No uniforms, no badges, but something in their eyes never faded. That trained coldness of someone who's seen the worst of the world and survived. There was something powerful in the way they greeted each other. Short nods, direct eye contact, no unnecessary words. Every face, marked by time, carried visible and invisible scars. Deep lines, gray hair, controlled movements. Men who looked like part of the town, invisible to the average eye, but who held inside them stories that would never be told. Jack climbed onto the back of an old pickup truck, laid out a faded map of the area on the hood, and pointed with his finger. "My granddaughter is alone. Two men are already there. Maybe more on the way. Isolated house, open terrain. Not much time." One of the men, tall, unshaven, with a hardened stare, crossed his arms and simply asked, "What's the plan?" Jack looked at each of them. Old comrades, brothers in arms, men who had once followed difficult orders without hesitation. But this time, there was no official mission, no commanding officer. This was personal. "We go in fast. Get her out of danger. No warning. No hesitation," Jack said, his voice full of a determination that left no room for debate. "Anyone who lays a hand on my granddaughter won't get a second chance." The group nodded, each one mentally going over what needed to be done, as if their bodies still remembered every move, even after all these years. As the sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky in golden and red tones, those quiet men disappeared into the streets of the town, blending into the shadows like ghosts. They weren't just going to save a little girl. They were going to make something deeply wrong right again. And for those who dared to threaten Ellie, the night was about to fall heavier than they could ever imagine. Inside the stuffy closet, Ellie kept her eyes tightly shut, as if somehow, by wishing hard enough, she could disappear from that place. Every breath was controlled, every movement deliberate. But even so, the fear made her heart pound so loudly, it seemed to echo against the thin wooden walls. Outside, the footsteps were unmistakable, firm, deliberate, completely numb to the fear they spread with every step. The old floorboards creaked under their heavy boots, and doors slammed into walls as they yanked open drawers, pulled furniture, and checked every corner of the house looking for her. Ellie was trembling, but fought hard not to make a sound. She knew she couldn't be found, not before her grandfather arrived. "She's taking too long," grumbled a rough voice, close enough that Ellie could feel the weight of the words through the thin closet door. "Relax," the other replied, his tone colder. "Once we grab the girl, we can negotiate. Scared kids bring in a good price. And if not, well, there's always another way to make someone pay. Ellie clutched the walkie-talkie tighter against her chest, feeling the tears sting in her eyes. She bit down hard on her lip, forcing the fear deep inside, reminding herself, word for word, of what her grandpa always used to say: fear is normal, but courage is acting even when you're afraid. Time felt like it was collapsing in on her, squeezing her chest like an invisible hand. Every second she stayed hidden felt like an eternity, and every sound only made the suffocating fear grow stronger, the kind that told her they could find her at any moment. The closet gave a soft creak as one of the men brushed his hand across the door, almost like he could sense she was there. Ellie held her breath so tightly her ribs began to ache. "She's got to be around here somewhere," one of them muttered. Time was running out, and Ellie knew that if her grandpa didn't get there soon, whatever was waiting on the other side of that door wouldn't just be a threat anymore. It would be real. Outside, the wind kept sweeping across the dirt road, kicking up dust and dry leaves, when suddenly a new sound tore through the heavy silence: the roar of tires screeching over gravel, accelerating with a fury that didn't match the slow pace of the morning. The criminals froze for a second, locking eyes in a quick, nervous glance. It wasn't the sound they were expecting. It wasn't backup. It wasn't a nosy neighbor. It was something else. Inside the closet, Ellie heard it too. The sound was distant, muffled, but it carried something she recognized instantly: hope. The tires skidded to a stop at the front of the house with a sharp crunch. Car doors slammed open with force. Boots hit the firm dirt ground. And then, footsteps, fast and deliberate, climbing the wooden porch that creaked under the firm weight of the men approaching. The sound was steady, controlled, completely different from the frantic chaos of the intruders who had stormed into the house just minutes earlier. It was as if the house itself recognized that finally, the ones arriving now were the ones who truly belonged there. And then, the voice came, firm, unshakable, without a hint of fear. "This house is protected." It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, spoken from the other side of the door, with the cold calm of someone who not only knew exactly what they were doing, but was fully ready for whatever came next. The men inside looked at each other, confused, and for the first time since they'd arrived, fear flickered in their eyes. Inside the closet, Ellie pressed the walkie-talkie tighter against her chest, a single, silent tear sliding down her cheek. She knew that voice. She knew that certainty. Her grandpa Jack was there, and for the men who dared to threaten his family, time had just run out. For a moment, the inside of the house was swallowed by a heavy, tense silence. Even the dust hanging in the air seemed to pause. The two criminals exchanged a quick, nervous glance. One of them, trying to regain control of the situation, reached for the gun he had hidden under his coat. The other moved toward the door, like he still believed intimidation might work. It was a mistake. The front door flew open with a sharp bang. No hesitation, and Jack Miller walked in, not as a tired old grandfather, but as the elite operator trained to act in chaos, to succeed where others fall. He moved fast, too fast for ordinary men to react. With two long strides, he disarmed the first intruder with a precise strike to the wrist, sending the gun flying across the room and hitting the floor with a metallic thud. Without breaking rhythm, he spun and locked the second man in a joint hold, slamming him hard against the living room wall, knocking a pained grunt out of him. Two more men, veterans who had answered Jack's call, came in right behind him, sweeping the house with sharp eyes, making sure no other threats were hiding nearby. It all happened in less than 20 seconds. 20 seconds to undo what those criminals had spent weeks planning. When the dust settled, when the last intruder was on the floor, zip-tied with makeshift restraints, Jack finally stopped. His eyes scanned the room, searching for what really mattered. "Ellie!" he called out, his voice steady, but now filled with urgency. From inside the closet, she pushed the door open hard and ran, darting across the room like an arrow. When she reached her grandfather, she threw herself into his arms without hesitation, holding on to him with all the strength that fear and relief mixed together could give. Jack wrapped her in a tight embrace, dropping to the floor with her, holding her close to his chest, like he could protect her from every evil in the world with the strength of his arms alone. "I told you I'd come," he whispered, resting his face against her hair. "I told you no one was going to touch you." And in that embrace, Ellie knew, without a doubt, that she was safe, truly safe. Red and blue lights sliced through the evening like flashing blades, reflecting off the windows of the house, still heavy with tension. Police sirens grew louder as they approached, but slowed down the moment the first officers saw the men lying on the living room floor, already taken down and restrained. Jack Miller stood tall, Ellie safely by his side, waiting like a sentinel in the middle of the chaos that had already been resolved. His old comrades remained silent, respecting the scene, as if they knew the worst hadn't yet been revealed. Two officers approached, weapons drawn, but paused when they saw Jack's stance. One of them recognized him. "Miller, you've got to be kidding me. You did this?" "They broke into my granddaughter's house," Jack replied, with the calm of someone who didn't need to justify anything. The rest was just a response. As the men were cuffed and loaded into patrol cars, investigators started opening the backpacks and phones they had confiscated. One by one, the data revealed itself: encrypted messages, maps of the area, fake documents, contacts with coded names. At first, it seemed like just an isolated kidnapping attempt, but as the police agents analyzed the files and cross-referenced the data with ongoing investigations, the truth started to take shape before them, like a dark puzzle coming together. It wasn't random. It wasn't a coincidence they had chosen that house. The officer leading the investigation walked over to Jack, holding a tablet with the newly uncovered records. "They're part of a network, Jack. A real one. Human trafficking. These two are just the tip of the iceberg. They were trying to set up a base here, and they started with the most remote, most vulnerable homes. Your granddaughter was just a test." Ellie looked up at her grandfather, eyes wide. Jack simply pulled her closer, holding her tighter. "A test that cost them dearly," he said, his voice flat, eyes steady. What had seemed like just an isolated nightmare was now the beginning of something much bigger. An operation that went beyond that house, beyond that town. And now, it had been exposed, all thanks to the courage of one girl and the silent promise of a grandfather who never fails. The next day, Ellie's house wasn't just the scene of a foiled attack. It had become a symbol. What once was silence had become a voice. What once was fear had become courage. The story spread through the town like wildfire. It didn't take long before faces once closed off by fear began to open up. One by one, store owners, neighbors, and locals who used to look the other way started showing up, this time, not to ask questions, but to speak up. The man who owned the market at the end of the road, who had noticed strange cars circling the neighborhood in recent weeks. Ellie's schoolteacher, who remembered a van parked way too long behind the building. Even an old fisherman from the pier showed up at the station with notes scribbled in worn-out notebooks, times, license plates, and descriptions he'd never had the courage to turn in until now. Jack stayed silent through it all. He turned down interviews. He turned down praise. All he wanted was to see his granddaughter safe, drawing peacefully on the front porch, like the world was still a simple place. But the town didn't let him go unnoticed. They started calling him a hero, the town's old hero, the man who didn't just save his granddaughter. He reignited a spark in everyone else that had nearly burned out. Posters went up with the faces of the fugitives. Support groups formed. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other started coming together. The reports began pouring in, and for the first time in years, the dark corridors where the criminal network had hidden began to be lit up by the truth. And Ellie? Ellie now walked through town beside her grandfather, not as a victim, but as a symbol. People greeted her gently, but with pride. She smiled shyly, holding Jack's hand, a hand that never let go. The town stood behind them, because everyone knew if evil could creep in slowly and silently, then courage, once awakened, could be loud, contagious, and impossible to stop. That little house by the coast, once forgotten by almost everyone, was now remembered as the place where a story of courage began. It wasn't the military. It wasn't the police. It wasn't some big official operation. It was a grandfather, an old retired soldier, moved only by the love for his granddaughter. And it was her, a 12-year-old girl, who had the courage to press a button, even while shaking, believing someone would come. And he did, not with tanks, not with spotlights, but with strength, with precision, with the silent promise that no one touches what he loves. The criminals were exposed, the network was dismantled, but what remained wasn't just arrests or reports. What remained was the certainty that, even in dark times, there are still people willing to act, to protect, to stand up. And it all started with a walkie-talkie and a young girl's faith in an old hero who never stopped being a soldier. Sometimes, all it takes is a grandfather's courage and a little girl's trust to change everything. If this story touched you, if you believe that courage can come in any size, share it. Someone out there might need to hear this today, and stay with us, because this might have been just one battle won, but there are many more waiting for someone who refuses to stay silent.